I met Michael when I was 11 years old, on a hot afternoon that smelled like dust, chalk, and sun-warmed metal. We were both waiting outside the principal's office, he for talking too much in class, me for accidentally breaking a window during a game of cricket. Somehow that was enough for a friendship to begin. From that day we were inseparable. We went through everything together. The awkward middle school years, the late-night study sessions, the university entrance exams that kept us up until dawn. Michael was always the smarter one, though he never bragged about it. He was calm, methodical, and naturally gifted in science. Everyone knew he was going to be a doctor someday. I, on the other hand, was the dreamer. I liked stories, words, and people. While he memorized anatomy and chemical reactions, I learned how to read faces and emotions. We balanced each other out. He'd pull me back when I got too lost in my head, and I'd push him to loosen up when he took life too seriously. We often joked that no matter where life took us, we'd still be old men sitting on a porch someday, laughing about how dumb we were in our youth. And then, in high school, Claire entered the picture. I still remember the first day Michael saw her. She'd just transferred from another school and was sitting 2 rows ahead of us in English class. She had long auburn hair, a soft laugh, and the kind of confidence that made everyone notice her. Michael couldn't stop staring. At first I teased him. "You crushing on her? She's way out of your league, man." He smiled in that quiet way he always did, like he knew something I didn't. "You'll see," he said. "She's going to be my wife one day." And somehow he was right. They started dating by the end of that school year. It wasn't dramatic or fast. It just happened slowly, naturally. Claire was kind, funny, and smart enough to keep up with him, at least back then. They went to prom together, graduated together, and applied to the same university. I won't lie. I missed him. But I was also happy for him. He seemed genuinely content, and for the first few years everything was good. We'd still hang out on weekends, watch football, grab dinner with our college group. But as time went on, something in Michael began to change. It started small. Missed hangouts, unanswered texts, shorter calls. At first I thought it was just the reality of adult life. We all get busy. But then, during one rare weekend when we met for coffee, I realized it wasn't just busyness. He seemed careful, like he was measuring every word he said. When I asked how things were going with Claire, he gave the kind of answer that was meant to sound reassuring but wasn't. "She's great," he said, smiling too tightly. "We're just figuring things out, you know?" I didn't push, but I could tell he wasn't being honest. Then, after college, he went on to medical school. Claire tried to become a teacher. I remember him proudly telling me that she wanted to work with kids, that she had a heart for it. But when I visited them a few years later, that light in her eyes had dimmed. She complained about the system, about the workload, about the parents. It was always someone else's fault. Still, Michael stood by her. Always. That loyalty was part of what made him such a good person, and, as I would learn later, part of what would destroy him. By the time they got married, Michael was deep into his residency. The ceremony was small but beautiful. I was his best man, and when I stood up to give my speech, I said something I truly believed at the time. If anyone can make love last, it's these two. They've already survived everything life could throw at them. Exams, distance, stress. If that doesn't prove their bond, nothing will. Everyone clapped. Claire smiled and Michael looked proud. For a while, I believed my own words. Then came the kids. First a boy, then a girl. They bought a little house outside the city, and I thought it was perfect for them. But gradually, I began to notice that everything in that household revolved around one person. Claire. Michael had always been thoughtful and logical. He believed in evidence, reason, and balance. Claire, though, she began to lean heavily into intuition and emotion. She didn't trust schools anymore, said they were teaching the wrong things. She didn't trust doctors, even though her husband was one. She didn't trust vaccines, or even certain foods. At first, I tried to have conversations with her. Gentle, curious questions, never judgmental. But every time, she'd get defensive, saying she knew what was best for her kids. Michael stayed quiet through all of it. That silence hurt more than her words. When we were kids, he used to challenge everything. Teachers, traditions, even me. He had a sharp mind and a fearless tongue. But now he just nodded, smiled, and avoided conflict. One night, after dinner at their house, I asked him privately why he never said anything. He sighed and looked at the floor. "It's not worth the fight," he said. "I pick my battles. But this is your kid's future, Mike," I told him. "You can't just stay out of it." He smiled sadly. "You'll understand when you're married." That line stayed with me for years. Time went on. My wife Anna and I had our own daughter, and life got busier. We saw Michael and Claire less often, though we still kept in touch. Birthdays, holidays, the occasional dinner. But each time, it became harder to ignore the growing distance. Their kids seemed behind. Not unintelligent, just sheltered. They didn't know simple things like how to read a clock or play with other children. Claire insisted it was because she was homeschooling them at their own pace. Michael never contradicted her. I tried to stay quiet. But as a father, I couldn't help feeling uneasy. The real breaking point came when Anna and I were finalizing our will. We wanted to name godparents for our daughter. People who would raise her if anything ever happened to us. Naturally, my first thought was Michael. He was like my brother. We'd promised each other years ago that we'd always be family. When I told him, he looked surprised, almost panicked. "Claire and I would be honored," he said quickly, but I hesitated. Something inside me whispered that maybe, just maybe, they weren't the right people anymore. Still, I didn't want to hurt him. So I said yes. A few months later, I realized I couldn't go through with it. I was visiting their home again, and during dinner, Claire started passionately talking about how modern medicine does more harm than good. I saw Michael quietly sipping his drink, saying nothing. Then she said something that chilled me. If one of our kids ever got really sick, I'd never take them to a hospital. I'd handle it naturally. I turned to Michael, expecting him to correct her, but he didn't. He just stared down at his plate. In that moment, I knew, if he couldn't stand up for his own children, he'd never be able to stand up for mine. That night, I drove home in silence, replaying everything in my head. Every warning sign I'd ignored, every small surrender I'd watched him make. The next morning, I called Anna and told her we needed to make a change. It wasn't easy. Telling Michael that we no longer wanted him and Claire as our daughter's guardians was one of the hardest things I've ever done. When I explained it to him, he looked like I'd just punched him. "Are you serious?" he said quietly. "I am," I told him. "I love you, man. You know that. But I can't trust that you'd make the right choices if something happened to us. You don't even speak up for your own family anymore." He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and said, "I understand." But his eyes said everything his voice didn't. That was the day our 20-year friendship began to die. We still texted occasionally after that. Birthdays, holidays, the polite surface-level stuff. But the bond we'd built, the unspoken understanding that we were brothers in everything but blood, was gone. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing. Maybe I should have been more patient. Maybe I should have fought harder for our friendship instead of walking away. But then I remember that conversation at his dinner table, the way his silence felt heavier than any argument. And I realized that some distances can't be crossed, not when values, beliefs, and courage no longer align. I still miss him, though. Every time I drive past our old school or hear a joke only he would have laughed at, I think about the boy who once dreamed big and spoke truth without fear. The boy who became a man I barely recognize. It's strange how some friendships don't end with a fight, but with silence. After that day, the day I told Michael I couldn't make him and Claire our daughter's guardians, there was no explosion, no argument, no emotional breakdown. Just quiet, a long, painful quiet that felt heavier than any shouting match could have been. He said he understood, but I could tell the words had pierced him. and I won't pretend I wasn't hurting too. It felt like cutting off a part of my own history, a part of myself that had grown beside his for 2 decades. For a while, I tried to reach out. I sent messages, "Hey, how are things?" or "Saw this old picture of us. Made me laugh." He replied politely at first, but short. A few words here and there, never a real conversation. Eventually, even those stopped. The next few months passed in a blur of work, parenting, and life. Anna noticed I was quieter than usual. She didn't press me, but I could tell she understood what was happening. One night when we were cleaning up after dinner, she finally said, "You did what you had to do, Evan. You made a decision for our daughter. It doesn't make you a bad friend." "I know," I said, though my voice lacked conviction, "but I still feel like I abandoned him." Anna sighed softly and placed her hand over mine. "You didn't abandon him. You just couldn't follow him where he chose to go." Her words stayed with me. Could it really be that simple? Or was it that I didn't try hard enough to pull him back? Months turned into a year, then another. By the time our daughter started school, I hadn't seen Michael in person for nearly 3 years. Sometimes I'd hear about him through mutual friends, little snippets that stung like reminders of something I'd lost. Mike's working at the new hospital, downtown. His kids are growing fast. Claire's started some kind of homeschooling blog. Every update felt like looking at a photograph from a life I was no longer part of. One afternoon, while scrolling through social media, I saw a post from Claire. It was a picture of their kids in matching homeschool uniforms she had designed herself. The caption read, "Grateful that I get to teach my little ones the truth, free from the system." The comments were filled with praise. "You're such an inspiration. So brave. Wish more parents were like you." And there, among the likes and hearts, was Michael's comment, "Proud of you. Always." I stared at that sentence for a long time. I wanted to believe he meant it, that he really was proud. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stopped believing his own words long ago. A few months later, something happened that forced me to face him again. It was a Saturday evening, just as the sun was setting. Anna and I were putting our daughter to bed when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael's name. I froze. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe he'd meant to call someone else, but then I answered, my heart pounding. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's been a while." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then his voice came, soft, strained. "Evan, I didn't know who else to call. Is everything okay?" "No," he said. "Claire's in the hospital." I didn't ask questions. I didn't hesitate. Within minutes, I was in my car, driving through the night toward the hospital he mentioned. When I arrived, I found him sitting in the waiting area, head in his hands. The sight hit me hard. He looked older, not just physically, but in a way that comes from years of quiet exhaustion. His hair had grayed at the edges, his posture slumped. He didn't look like the confident man I once knew. He looked defeated. When he saw me, his eyes widened in disbelief. Then, without a word, he stood and hugged me. It wasn't like our usual friendly embrace. This one was desperate, shaky, like he was holding on to something slipping away. "What happened?" I asked once we sat down. He ran a hand through his hair. She collapsed. It was sudden. Low blood pressure, dehydration, stress. They're still running tests. "Is she going to be okay?" He nodded slowly. "They said she'll recover." "But Evan..." His voice broke a little. "She refused to come here at first. I had to beg her. She kept saying she could fix it with rest and natural remedies." I stayed quiet. I didn't want to say I told you so. He didn't need that right now. Hours passed as we sat together in silence. Occasionally doctors or nurses would come by, and I could see the conflict in Michael's eyes every time they spoke. Like he was caught between two worlds, one built on reason, the other on loyalty. At around 2 a.m., the doctor told us that Claire was stable. Michael let out a breath of relief and whispered, "Thank God." I thought that might be our moment, the crack in the wall between us. But when we walked to the hospital cafeteria to get some coffee, he was quiet again, guarded. Finally, I said, "You did the right thing bringing her here." He looked up at me, eyes tired. Yeah, but I should have done it sooner. Why didn't you? He took a long sip of coffee before answering. Because she doesn't listen to me anymore. She thinks I've turned against her beliefs. If I push too hard, she shuts down completely. So I've learned to just stay quiet. I nodded, though my chest ached for him. That's not a marriage, Mike. That's survival. He gave a sad laugh. Maybe, but it's my life now. When Claire was discharged 2 days later, I offered to drive them home. She was pale but alert, thanking me for being there for Michael. Her tone was polite but distant, as if we were old acquaintances rather than people who used to share dinner tables and laughter. During the drive, she spoke softly about how this was a sign that she needed to take better care of herself, how stress was just another modern disease. Michael didn't argue. He just nodded along, gripping the steering wheel tightly. When we reached their house, she went inside first. Michael lingered by the car for a moment. Thanks for coming, he said. You don't have to thank me, I replied. You're my best friend, he smiled faintly. I was once, still are, I said, meaning it. That hasn't changed. He looked like he wanted to believe me, but then he shook his head. You don't know how far apart we've drifted, Evan. Sometimes I don't even recognize myself anymore. Then find your way back, I told him. You're still the same guy who dreamed of changing lives. That's who you are. He didn't answer. He just gave me a long, tired look, then walked back toward the house. For a while after that, I thought maybe things would improve. We started texting again occasionally. Nothing deep. But it was something. The kind of small talk that felt like the first crack of light through a long-closed door. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't last. Claire recovered, and almost immediately, she went back to posting about her beliefs online. She wrote long blog entries about trusting nature over science, and how hospitals only treat symptoms, not causes. Michael liked every post. I wanted to believe he was just being supportive, but I also knew that each like was another piece of his silence, another surrender. One afternoon, Anna and I were out shopping when we ran into them by chance. It was awkward at first, like bumping into someone from a past life. The kids had grown. Their son was tall and quiet, their daughter shy and soft-spoken. Claire greeted us warmly, almost overly so, while Michael stood a little behind her, smiling politely. As we talked, Anna asked their kids if they were enjoying school. Claire answered before they could. Oh, we're still homeschooling, she said proudly. It's been such a blessing. They learn so much more at home than they would in those overcrowded classrooms. Anna smiled politely. That's nice. It must be a lot of work. Claire waved her hand. Oh, it's not work when it's your calling. I glanced at Michael, expecting him to say something. Anything. But he just nodded and smiled. When we left the store, Anna was quiet. Then she said softly, You were right to do what you did. I couldn't have them raising our daughter either. I didn't reply. I just stared out the window as we drove, feeling the weight of a friendship I couldn't save. Months passed again, and life moved forward. Our daughter grew older, started new hobbies, made new friends. I focused on work, on family, on everything except the ache of what I'd lost. But every now and then, I'd see something, a photo, a memory, a familiar street, and feel that ache return. It wasn't until 2 years later that I heard from Michael again. This time, it was an email. The subject line read, I don't know who else to tell. I opened it immediately. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs. He wrote that his son had fallen ill. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough that they needed medical attention. He said Claire had insisted on treating him at home again, and he'd gone along with it at first. Until it got worse. Then, when he finally took their son to the hospital, she'd been furious. She'd accused him of betrayal, said he didn't trust her judgment. The argument had torn through their household like a storm. The email ended with a single line that broke me. I think I'm losing my family, Evan. And I don't know if it's my fault for being silent all these years. I wanted to call him immediately, but I didn't. Instead, I sat at my desk for nearly an hour, just staring at the screen, wondering how we'd gotten here. The boy who once debated teachers for fun now couldn't speak in his own home without fear of starting a war. That night, after putting our daughter to bed, I finally replied, "Mike, it's not too late to speak up. You can't keep living like this. Silence doesn't protect people. It only protects the problem. If you ever need me, I'm here." I didn't know if he'd respond, but deep down, I hoped that maybe, just maybe, it would be the message that woke him up. When Michael finally replied to my email, it was nearly midnight. I remember the sound of my phone buzzing against the bedside table, the faint glow cutting through the dark room. I reached for it half asleep and saw his name. My pulse quickened. "Thanks for answering, Evan. I don't know what to do anymore." That one line was followed by a story that spilled out like a confession. He said his son, Adam, had been sick for weeks. Persistent cough, fever, weight loss. Claire kept insisting it was seasonal, that modern medicine would only make it worse. She tried herbal teas, oils, fasting. Nothing helped. When Adam's fever spiked one night, Michael finally picked him up and drove to the hospital. It was the first real stand he'd taken against her in years. He said that when Claire realized what he'd done, she didn't yell. She just looked at him with cold disbelief and whispered, "You've betrayed me." That hurt him more than any argument could have. He wrote that he hadn't slept since, that she wouldn't talk to him, that the house felt like a stranger's place. He was afraid his marriage was breaking apart. And at the same time, he felt something else. Relief. Reading his message, I could almost hear his voice again. The quiet logic, the conflict, the exhaustion. I knew then that the man I'd grown up with wasn't gone. He was just buried under years of silence. I typed back carefully. "You did the right thing, Mike. You saved your son. That's what matters. Maybe this is your moment to start being honest. With her, with yourself." I hit send, knowing the next few weeks would test him more than anything ever had. Days passed with no response. Then, one Saturday morning, my phone rang again. It was him. "Hey," I said quickly. "How are things?" He hesitated before answering. "Different. Complicated." I could hear traffic in the background, the sound of kids shouting faintly. "Where are you?" "At the park," he said. "With the kids. Claire's at her sister's place." We talked for nearly an hour. He sounded lighter, but wary, like someone learning how to breathe again after being underwater for too long. He told me Adam was recovering well. Doctors had caught the infection early enough. He thanked me for pushing him to act. Then his voice lowered. "She's still angry. She says I humiliated her. Her family's siding with her. I'm the villain now." "Mike," I said softly, "being the villain in someone's story doesn't make you wrong. Sometimes it just means you stopped playing along." He didn't respond for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I miss when things were simple." "So do I admitted. But maybe this is what growth looks like. Messy, painful, necessary. Before hanging up, he said something I hadn't heard in years. "Thanks, brother." That one call reopened something between us. We started talking more. Texts, short calls, the occasional meetup for coffee. It wasn't the same as before, but it was real. And for the first time in years, honest. He told me about the tension at home. Claire had doubled down on her beliefs, surrounding herself with online communities that echoed everything she said. Michael tried to stay patient, but he also started setting quiet boundaries, taking the kids to their checkups, introducing them to extracurricular activities, letting them meet other children. Every small act of defiance came with consequences. Arguments, guilt, nights spent sleeping on the couch, but he didn't stop. One evening, over dinner at my house, he admitted something that caught me off guard. "She told me she doesn't trust me with the kids anymore," he said, staring into his glass. "She thinks I'll fill their heads with lies." Anna reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "You're their father, Michael. You have a right to protect them too." He smiled sadly. "I know. I just wish she saw it that way." The turning point came a few months later. Michael called me one night in a panic. "Evan, can you come over? Please." I didn't ask why. I just went. When I arrived, the living room lights were on, and the air felt heavy. Claire sat on the couch, trembling with anger, a suitcase by her feet. The kids were upstairs, crying. Michael stood near the doorway, pale, shoulders tight. "She's leaving," he said quietly. Claire's eyes flashed. "You went behind my back again. You took our daughter to a therapist. You let a stranger poison her mind with diagnoses. She needed help." Michael shouted for the first time I'd ever heard. "She's been anxious for months. She barely sleeps." Their voices echoed through the house. I wanted to step in, but this wasn't my place. I could only watch the wreckage unfold. Claire turned to me suddenly. "You did this. You and your wife filled his head with doubts. You think you're better than me because you trust your precious doctors." "Claire," I began, but she cut me off. "Don't. You have no idea what it's like to be judged for doing what you believe is right for your family." And with that, she grabbed her suitcase and walked out. Michael didn't move. He just stared at the door long after it closed, his breathing uneven. Finally, he whispered, "I think it's over." He stayed with me that night. We sat on the porch, the sky heavy with rain, neither of us speaking for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was soft. "I thought I could save her, Evan. That if I stayed quiet long enough, she'd find her balance again. But all I did was disappear." I looked at him. "Then maybe it's time you find yourself again." He nodded slowly, as if testing the idea. Over the next few weeks, things moved fast. Claire stayed at her sister's, refusing to answer his calls. The kids stayed with him, and for the first time, I saw glimpses of the old Michael, teaching them science experiments, helping with art projects, laughing freely. But I also saw the guilt. He blamed himself for everything, for not speaking sooner, for letting years slip by in silence. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, he told me, "I don't know who I am without her anger. I built my life around trying not to upset her." "Then rebuild it around peace," I said. "Start small. Start with truth." He gave me a tired smile. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," I admitted. "But it's worth it." Months passed. The divorce papers came. It was mutual on paper, but I knew the truth. Nothing about it was peaceful. Claire moved to another town with her sister, visiting the kids on weekends. Michael tried to keep things civil, though every conversation left him drained. Through it all, he leaned on me. And slowly, painfully, he began to heal. He started volunteering at a community clinic. He reconnected with his parents. He even began therapy, something he'd once brushed off as not necessary. I could see the light coming back. One afternoon, while we were fixing the fence in my backyard, he said, "You know, I used to think strength meant keeping quiet, not causing waves. But now I realize silence isn't strength. It's surrender." I smiled. "Took you long enough to figure that out." He chuckled. "Yeah, guess I needed a few years of hard lessons." We stood there for a moment, side by side, the sun dipping low behind the trees. For the first time in a long while, it felt like we were back where we started. Two friends who believed in something good again. But life, as always, doesn't stay still. One morning, about 6 months later, Michael called me again. This time his voice sounded different, not panicked but shaken. "Evan," he said. "Claire's been in an accident." My heart dropped. "Is she okay?" "She's in critical condition." "The kids are with me." I didn't hesitate. I drove straight to the hospital, my chest tight with the cruel irony of it all. After everything, it had come full circle. Back to a hospital, back to the place where silence and decisions met. When I arrived, he was pacing outside the ICU. His hands were trembling. "It was a car crash. They said she wasn't wearing her seatbelt."